piercing, irreversible, when a person stops hoping the world will understand them. It's not dramatic. There's no audience, no applause, just silence. The kind that settles in your bones when you realize no one is coming to fix it. No one is staying up at night thinking about your pain. And in that silence, something ancient wakes up. A kind of strength that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, and doesn't need to be seen. That's the moment you stop performing and start becoming. Because the world may be indifferent, but you don't have to be powerless. The Stoics understood this long before us. They believed power begins when expectations die, and in that death, your real life begins. If you're someone who's ready to stop chasing validation and start cultivating inner power, consider subscribing as a quiet vow to yourself, a step toward a life rooted in discipline, clarity, and self-respect. Because here, we don't chase the world's applause. We build what the world can't ignore. Most people carry a quiet fantasy that their suffering is visible, that if they just hurt enough, someone will step in, that maybe if they just word it right, someone will understand. It's a soft hope, often unspoken, built deep into the way we're raised. If I'm in pain, the world will care. But then life happens. Pain is ignored. Tears go unnoticed. The phone stays silent. And that's when something shifts. You begin to see the illusion for what it really is. Not a reflection of your worth, but a reflection of how consumed people are by their own chaos. Everyone is battling something you'll never fully see, just like they'll never fully see yours. And if you build your identity on being seen, you will spend your life feeling invisible. That quiet ache of being overlooked, that's not cruelty, that's reality. And if you look closely, it might be trying to teach you something important. When we're young, we believe that pain deserves recognition. We think that if we suffer, someone owes us comfort. But the truth is, life doesn't hand out medals for endurance. It doesn't send angels when you're on your knees. It just moves on. People go about their lives. Friends forget. Strangers scroll. Not out of malice, but because they're drowning in their own problems. That might sound harsh, but harsh doesn't mean untrue. And here's the strange twist. That realization, painful as it is the first step toward becoming free. Because once you stop expecting the world to respond to your pain, you stop waiting. You stop freezing your life in hopes that someone will notice you're stuck. You begin to move for reasons that have nothing to do with applause. Carl Jung once said, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you." But what he didn't say, what you learn through experience, is that most people don't ask because they care. They ask so they can fit you into a box that makes sense to them. They don't see you. They see their idea of you. And when you stop performing for that gaze, you finally start living for something real. There's a kind of sorrow that comes with realizing you're not the main character in anyone's story, but your own. It's not rejection. It's simply gravity. No one owes you understanding. No one is required to hold your hand through the fog. And while that can make the world feel colder, it also makes your inner world burn brighter, because now you're the one lighting the fire. No more waiting for someone to read between the lines of your silence. No more hoping that your quiet breakdown will be noticed and gently mended by someone who just happens to get it. You get it now, and that changes everything. That disappointment, the one that used to sting, becomes something else. It becomes clarity, and clarity is the first real freedom. This is where the Stoics found their strength, not in being untouched by pain, but in refusing to outsource their healing. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily, "Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about your neighbors." In other words, stop hoping someone else will see your wounds and name your value. The more you focus on being seen, the less you see yourself. And ironically, the more invisible you become. You become noise in someone else's life, rather than signal in your own. But when you finally let go of the hope that others will witness your suffering and give it weight, that's when you begin to build something indestructible. Not because you're harder, but because you're clearer. You start noticing how much of your identity was shaped around being seen, around the belief that someone, somewhere, should care. And when they didn't, you took it personally. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. Just because people don't care doesn't mean you're unworthy. It just means they're human, flawed, overwhelmed, distracted, just like you. The game was never about being seen. It was about waking up to the fact that you were always watching. You've been the one living inside your mind this whole time. You've been the only witness to the full weight of your thoughts. That's not a curse. That's a gift. Because it means you are the one with the power to change your narrative. Not them, you. There's power in being unseen. There's clarity in walking without needing an audience. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." And that's what happens when you stop hoping to be seen. You start becoming, not for attention, not for recognition, but because something inside you refuses to stay small. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes your blueprint. The silence that once haunted you becomes your teacher. The solitude that once scared you becomes your home. And when that shift happens, you no longer need to broadcast your wounds. You just carry them differently, not as a burden, but as proof that you kept going. So maybe being overlooked wasn't the tragedy you thought it was. Maybe it was the beginning, the slow, quiet death of illusion, and the birth of something real, something solid, something that no longer seeks validation because it's too busy building something permanent. You don't need to be seen to become something great. You need to see yourself clearly, honestly, without decoration. That's where everything changes. That's where your real life begins. When no one listens, something unexpected happens. You start listening to yourself. Not the surface voice, the one that echoes what others expect from you, but the quieter one underneath. The one you've ignored because it wasn't loud enough to compete with the noise of the world. But in the absence of applause, silence grows roots. You begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly, not as background noise, but as guidance. It's strange at first, uncomfortable even. You're used to checking your reflection in the eyes of others. But when those eyes turn away, you learn to see yourself from the inside. And that's when something shifts. You begin to move differently, not because someone told you to, not because someone believed in you, but because you decided to show up, without witnesses, without cheerleaders, without someone holding the door open. Self-reliance doesn't arrive in a burst of confidence. It arrives slowly, often disguised as loneliness. You wake up one day and realize no one's checking in, no one's asking how you're doing. And instead of falling apart, you start building. You begin taking yourself seriously, not because others do, but because you've grown tired of waiting. How many times have you paused your growth hoping someone would give you permission to continue? Hoping they'd say it's the right time, the right move, the right direction. But what if that permission never comes? What if no one ever says you're ready? Would you stay frozen forever? Or would you finally claim the authority that was always yours? That's where real power begins, not in being chosen, but in choosing yourself. The world teaches us to seek validation like it's oxygen, but the Stoics knew that peace isn't found in popularity, it's found in discipline. Epictetus said, "No person is free who is not master of themselves." Freedom doesn't come from being supported. It comes from knowing that even when you aren't, you will continue. That even when the room is empty, you'll do the work anyway. And not out of bitterness, but because the work matters. Because you matter. When you understand that, showing up stops being a performance. It becomes an act of self-respect. And in that quiet, a new relationship forms, not with the world, but with your own mind. You begin to trust it more. You ask it what it needs. You listen to the fatigue in your body, the pull in your gut, the fire behind your chest. You stop outsourcing your intuition. You stop living reactively. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." That awakening doesn't feel like a dramatic breakthrough. It feels like subtle, consistent decisions that build a foundation under your feet. You start keeping your promises to yourself. You go for the walk. You write the words. You say no when something drains you. These aren't loud acts, but they build something no one can see from the outside: trust. And trust in yourself is the currency of freedom. There's a quiet kind of strength that develops when you realize you are your own backup plan, when the silence doesn't scare you anymore, when you don't need to announce your every move or explain your every feeling, when you don't beg for someone to notice that you're trying, because you know the effort you're making, you know the storms you've walked through, you know what it took to still be here, choosing growth instead of collapse. That's not arrogance. That's integrity. You're no longer performing for the world. You're becoming for yourself. There will still be moments of doubt, moments when you wish someone would say, "I see you." But now you don't depend on it. You no longer fall apart in its absence. You carry yourself with the quiet awareness that you've earned your own respect. And that's rare. That's what makes people pause when you enter a room, not because you demanded attention, but because your energy says, "I don't need it." Seneca once wrote, "The greatest empire is to rule oneself." And ruling yourself doesn't look like perfection. It looks like consistency in the face of invisibility. It looks like doing what matters even when no one applauds. It looks like holding your standards high, even when no one is watching. When you build from that place, you're no longer dependent on external structure. You become the structure. You don't collapse when someone pulls away. You don't unravel when someone misunderstands you, because your foundation was never built on their understanding in the first place. It was built on clarity, on quiet decisions made in solitude, on the strength of waking up and moving forward again and again, because that's who you've chosen to become. And this is the most important part. Once you begin to rely on yourself in this way, you stop resenting others for not being who you needed. You release them. You stop waiting for them to return, to notice, to explain. You no longer tie your progress to their presence. You move regardless, not with coldness, but with grace. You become free, not because the pain is gone, but because it no longer defines the path. You carry it, but it doesn't carry you. That's what true self-reliance looks like. Not an absence of need, but a deep inner steadiness that says, even if no one sees me, even if no one comes, even if no one helps, I will keep going. Because this life is mine to live, and I will not wait for anyone to give me permission to become who I was always meant to be. We live in a world that rewards exposure. Every feeling must be shared, every wound displayed, every moment of struggle turned into something others can comment on. The more visibly broken you are, the more attention you receive. But not all attention is healing. Some of it is hollow. Some of it keeps you dependent on being seen as wounded to feel connected. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to perform your pain. You start editing your suffering, packaging it for sympathy. You turn real emotions into content, thinking it will bring you closer to others. But it doesn't. It just makes your healing public property. What was once sacred becomes consumed. What was once your inner world becomes a storyline for others to follow and forget. There's a difference between honesty and emotional performance. One comes from depth, the other from habit. One is quiet, the other rehearsed, and most of us were never taught the difference. We confuse expression with healing. We think that just because we talk about it, we've worked through it. But sometimes, the more you speak of a wound, the more it stays alive. Not everything needs to be narrated. Some things need to be felt, endured, integrated, in silence. The Stoics weren't emotionless, they were composed. They believed in feeling deeply, but without letting those feelings control the trajectory of their lives. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, wrote, "Be like the cliff against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it." He didn't mean suppress emotion. He meant, don't let it become a performance. Let it become presence. We've become conditioned to believe that silence is weakness, that if we don't express every feeling, we're hiding. But some things are not meant to be shared. Some parts of your story are sacred precisely because they belong only to you. Keeping something private doesn't mean you're ashamed. It means you're protecting something precious. And that unnerves people, because silence can't be dissected. It can't be pitied or praised. It demands space. It creates mystery. And mystery, especially in a world addicted to access, feels threatening. Carl Jung spoke often of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we bury or project. But he also said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." The truth is, not every form of healing needs to be visible. Some of the deepest transformations happen when no one is watching, when you're sitting with your thoughts, when you're choosing not to respond, not to prove, not to explain, when you let your emotions pass through without needing them to be seen, liked, or validated. That's not suppression. That's sovereignty. It's easy to mistake the loud for the strong, but strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and still and completely uninterested in being understood. You don't have to prove your growth. You don't have to narrate your healing in real time. You can keep it to yourself and let the results speak later. And that patience, that refusal to perform, is what gives you power, because it means your peace isn't up for public negotiation. There's a kind of beauty in becoming unexplainable, in being someone who no longer shares every emotional bruise just to receive softness in return. You learn that not everyone deserves access to your struggle, not because you're hiding, but because you've stopped offering your pain as a way to earn connection. When you stop broadcasting your wounds, you stop attracting people who are only there to observe the damage, and slowly you begin attracting people who respect what you've built in silence. Seneca said, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. But once you've faced adversity and grown from it, you don't need to display the scars to justify your strength. You don't need to keep reopening wounds to remind others of what you've endured. You've proven it to yourself. That's enough." The moment you realize your emotions are not a currency for attention, you stop spending them so carelessly. You start guarding your inner life like something rare, because it is. And in that guarding, you find clarity. You start to realize how much energy was spent explaining what didn't need to be explained. You feel how much power was lost in asking to be understood by people who didn't have the depth to understand themselves. You watch how the crowd celebrates vulnerability, but forgets to mention that real vulnerability isn't exposure. It's discernment. It's knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. It's choosing who gets to see the real you and who only gets the surface. You don't need the world to validate your emotions for them to matter. You don't need to turn your pain into art just to justify why it hurts. You can hold that pain quietly. You can heal without display. You can grieve without an audience. And when you do, something incredible happens. You stop fearing the silence. You begin to feel at home inside it, because it no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like return. A return to yourself, a return to what's real. There's nothing wrong with expressing emotion, but when expression becomes a performance, it robs you of your power. Sovereignty begins the moment you choose presence over performance. The moment you stop explaining yourself to feel safe. The moment you realize your peace isn't fragile, it's forged in solitude. And when others can no longer predict you through your emotional patterns, they start to respect the depth they can't access. Not because you became colder, but because you became wiser. You don't owe anyone a front row seat to your healing, and you don't need to bleed in public to prove you're human. Some things are meant to be held close. Some truths are meant to be whispered only to yourself. That's not hiding. That's maturity. And in a world that glorifies noise, that kind of quiet becomes its own form of rebellion, its own form of freedom. Rejection feels personal because it touches something primal in us, the need to belong, to be seen, to be accepted as we are. But often, what feels like rejection is actually redirection. You weren't dismissed because you lacked value. You were pushed aside because your depth couldn't be digested by shallow eyes. Your silence was mistaken for absence, your self-containment for coldness. You were misunderstood not because you failed to express, but because you carry a frequency most people aren't tuned to. That doesn't make you wrong, it makes you rare. The world, for the most part, doesn't recognize nuance. It celebrates what's easy to label, easy to consume, easy to predict. So when you don't fit into those neat boxes, you become inconvenient. And in a world rushing to categorize, inconvenience is often discarded before it's explored. It's easy to internalize that as a flaw. To think, if I were louder, if I smiled more, if I softened my edges, maybe I'd be accepted. But that's the trap. The belief that your value lies in being legible to others. You weren't made to shrink into their comprehension. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who others can easily understand, not who fits the mold, but who you are when no one is watching and you've stopped trying to be approved." That kind of authenticity often comes at the cost of comfort. It invites misunderstanding. It requires solitude. But it also creates space for a deeper kind of transformation, one that isn't driven by applause, but by alignment. There comes a point when you stop interpreting rejection as loss and begin to see it as clarity. Every person who overlooks you, every space that doesn't welcome you, every silence that follows your presence, it all reveals something. Not about your worth, but about where your energy doesn't belong. That insight is priceless. It saves you years of self-doubt. It teaches you to invest where you're valued, not just tolerated. And once you learn that, you stop chasing explanations. You stop wondering why someone didn't choose you. You realize that not being chosen was the blessing, because it gave you back to yourself. There's a quiet revolution that begins when you stop trying to be understood. You begin to redirect all the energy you used to spend on being seen into actually building something. Something that doesn't need to be explained. Something that stands on its own. A body of work, a lifestyle, a discipline. You shift from emotional scarcity, constantly trying to prove your worth, to psychological sovereignty, where your existence is no longer up for debate. That's where your center of gravity moves inward. You're not moved by approval or rattled by dismissal. You become grounded. And grounded people are magnetic, not because they seek attention, but because they carry something stable in a world that spins too fast. People will still misread you. They'll create stories to make sense of your quiet, your ambition, your boundaries. Let them. You're not responsible for correcting every false narrative. Marcus Aurelius said, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject. You are the subject. And most people don't know you. Not really. They see glimpses, fragments. They project, assume, simplify. And while that used to bother you, now you see it for what it is, noise. The moment you let go of the need to correct the noise, your focus sharpens. You get more done. You sleep deeper. You move cleaner.
हम में से ज्यादातर लोग क्यों इंग्लिश नहीं बोल पाते? हमारे साथ बात करने के लिए कोई नहीं है, इसलिए आपको सुपरनोवा एआई यूज करनी चाहिए, क्योंकि अगर आप बात नहीं करेंगे
Move cleaner, because now your life is no longer built around being perceived